Isn't that a lovely film? The videographer, born and raised in the Anderson Valley, and it is a submission to the Mendocino Film Festival that happens every year in June in Mendocino, California. Hello and welcome. This is an introduction to the Anderson Valley, a masterclass sponsored by the Anderson Valley Wine Growers Association. And my name is Karina Strauss. I am a sommelier. I've worked at multiple restaurants in the Bay Area. I moved up to Mendocino County to help open up the Harbor House Inn in Elk, California. And we attained Mendocino County's first Michelin star. Since then, I have moved to Boonville, a community within the Anderson Valley whose population is about 1,000. I'm so excited to have today's panelists. We have Alan Green joining us with over 45 years in the wine industry, beginning as a vintner. He was the founder of Greenwood Ridge Vineyards, which has been since sold. He also created the International Canned Wine Competition in 2019, and he has the Guinness Book of World Records largest collection of canned wine at about 1,400. Alan was integral part of beginning the Anderson Valley AVA. We also have Tom Elkier, a walking encyclopedia. This incredible gentleman has been so helpful in putting this class together. He has written cover stories for Wine Spectator and Wine Enthusiast. He's had featured articles in the San Francisco Chronicle. He is an author, and he has written the books Adventures in Wine, Escape to Wine Country, and True to Our Roots. And then we have superstar sommelier Evan Huffer, who's given me personally one of my favorite pairings at Single Thread Farms. He has a long career of working with incredible restaurants in Las Vegas and in the Bay Area. He served as head sommelier and restaurant director at 𝚒𝚘 in San Francisco. He was the opening wine director at Single Thread Farms, and he helped them attain their Michelin stars within 2 years. He also just recently joined the team at 𝚘𝚒, an incredible marketing and hospitality consulting group. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Please feel free to chime in at any point. So let's start by telling everybody where we are. This is a beautiful map of California and Oregon. It highlights some of the West Coast Pinot Noir regions. Well, we are in Northern California. We are in Mendocino County. We are above Sonoma County, below Humboldt County. We are 110 miles from San Francisco. We are an hour from Healdsburg and 30 minutes to the dramatic coastal town of Mendocino. Now let's zoom in on our valley, our quaint little valley. You know, it is about 1 mile wide by 15 miles long. It is flanked by 2 incredible ridges. We have the Pacific Ocean to the north, and we have Yorkville Highlands to the south. I beg your pardon, Yorkville Highlands AVA to the south. And for those of you that do not know what an AVA or an American viticulture area, I'm going to invite Tom to join us in discussing this.
So an appellation is basically, it comes from the French word appellation, which means to name something or to title it. And the United States adopted the European mode of defining regions by a name that you can put on a label so that consumers know what they're getting. And the appellation phenomenon took off in the United States in the late 70s and early 80s. And Anderson Valley was in the thick of that. And the real purpose at that time was to provide a threshold. So if a wine says Anderson Valley on the label, or Napa Valley, or Russian River Valley, or any other appellation in the country, 85% of the grapes in that wine have to come from that appellation. So that's a higher standard than, say, the grape labeling, which is only 75%. If you buy a bottle of Merlot, it has to be at least 75% Merlot. It could be 25% other grapes. For the appellation standard, it's higher. It's 85% has to be from the appellation. So when you see Anderson Valley on a label, that means it's mostly Anderson Valley fruit. And one of the beautiful things about Anderson Valley is that our Pinot Noirs are almost always 100% Pinot Noir from this appellation. People really tend not to mix much and don't bring in fruit from outside. It's the pure deal.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom. So we have the Yorkville Highlands appellation or American viticulture area to the south. We have the Mendocino Ridge American viticulture area to the southwest, which is also known as Islands in the Sky. So going back to the Anderson Valley, 80% of our vineyards are within a half a mile of Highway 128. We have the unincorporated communities of Boonville, Philo, and Navarro. Let's talk about the first 100 years in Anderson Valley. So in the 1850s, we have the Anderson family roaming around Northern California looking for a place to settle. Well, they come across what they describe as a jewel-like valley. They decide to settle it and name it after themselves. So then we have the gold rush. We have European immigrants with their agricultural traditions and wine growing backgrounds settle the valley. And apples seem to be the superstar. During this time, the valley is still remote and still very challenging to get to. And these physical isolation factors contribute to the culture of the valley, so much so that they create their own jargon or slang to delineate themselves from the outsiders. We call this boont or boontling. And if you get a chance to research it, it is quite fun. In the 1880s and 90s, we have a population swell with a bustling logging community and a railroad line that connects the Anderson Valley with the coastal communities of Greenwood and Cuffy's Cove. This moves some of the settlers into Greenwood Ridge, and they have a little better luck with their warm climate varietals. It becomes known as Vinegar Hill. We have the turn of the century, and in 1911, we have the Pinoli family establishing the first bonded winery in Anderson Valley. As transportation evolves and access to the valley becomes much easier, we have a decent road connecting Sonoma County and a post-war enthusiasm. We had sawmills, stores, gas stations, and bars in the Anderson Valley. Now in 1946, we have the historical Italian-Swiss colony winery experiment with the Anderson Valley. They purchased 200 acres on the valley floor for plantings of Uni Blanc and French Colombard. They also signed purchasing contracts with other Anderson Valley growers. Unfortunately, things do not go very well. Wrong varietal choices and an unknown root louse known as 𝚘𝚑 brought devastation to the project and the valley. Okay, now let's talk about the 50s, 60s, and 70s. As we all know, there was this great want of the American dream in the 1850s. We had better roads and better automobiles. This certainly was an exciting time. Now let's talk about the 60s. As we all know, California was a hotbed of counterculture movement, a sort of tune in and drop out attitude. People wanting to get away from it all and live a simpler life or live off of the land. A few of those people decided to plant vineyards. And although Alan was not living here full time, he does know the history quite well. And I'd like to invite you, Alan, to share that with us.
Thank you. Well, when I got here in 1971, there were no wineries yet. There were a handful of vineyards, including several pre-prohibition Zinfandel vineyards, Duprat, Capucci, Zini on the ridges. And there were some new vineyard plantings on the valley floor, Donald Edmeades planted in 1964, and Tony Hush and Gretchen Hush planted in 68 in Philo. And I think Tony, along with his professional vineyard guy, Al White, they were the ones that first sort of figured out what varieties ought to be planted on the valley floor. And they planted Gewürztraminer and Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And Tony Hush also planted Greenwood Ridge. He planted Merlot, Cab, and Riesling up on the ridge top because he figured he could ripen those varieties above the fog. But in those days, there were really very few people that knew much about growing grapes. When we wanted to do some planting in 1974, I had to borrow a couple of workers from Darren Edmeades and have them try to explain to me, and I had to use my high school Spanish to try to figure out, because they knew how to plant grapes. And then I had to try to explain this to the gals from the co-op nearby, Rainbow. They had experience with gardening, and that was my planning crew until they decided in the afternoon to work topless, which distracted everybody else and not much got done. But that nowadays, of course, you just hire a professional crew and they come in from Sonoma County and plant your vineyard in a few days and it's all done. So things were a lot different then.
Thank you, Alan. I do feel like this movement really contributed to the culture of sustainability in farming in Mendocino County and certainly in Anderson Valley. I am currently at Domaine Anderson, who is a certified organic winery as well as a biodynamic winery. Let's talk about the 80s. So it was an exciting time in California. We have multiple California regions really pining to become official wine regions. And for some reason, 1983 was one of the huge years of multiple California wine regions petitioning for appellation. And this, again, I would like to invite Alan into sharing his experience with this.
Well, in those days, there were not a lot of track records of previous appellations to go on. So we were sort of winging it. And as the slide shows, there were 7 wineries here and 16 vineyards. But we were all very cooperative on trying to get the appellation together. And it seemed like generally the watershed of the Navarro River would be the proper boundaries. But in those days, if you had opposition to your appellation, it wasn't going to go through. So the boundaries were drawn to include all the existing vineyards that could possibly be within the appellation so that there wouldn't be any opposition. And so that meant that the boundaries sort of exceeded the watershed of the Navarro River in a couple directions. But since there was no opposition, it went through.
Wonderful. Let's talk about another thing that was happening in the 80s, sparkling wine. One of my favorite things to drink and talk about. We have, in 1981, John Scharfenberger bottling his first sparkling wine. In doing my research for this class, I had a conversation with him and I asked him what inspired him. He shares a story about he was involved in a group of Mendocino County vintners and they created a tasting group. And so they would get together and taste and compare wines from different parts of the world. And this specific tasting he was talking about, the theme was champagne. And he really felt like a lot of the vintners were a little too hard on the champagne, but this sparked an interest, a true interest in him. And he set out to make incredible sparkling wine like the champagne houses of France. Since Scharfenberger Cellars has been poured at notable historical events as well as the White House. Now in 1983, we have Hanley Cellars. Lulu Hanley, who was the daughter of Milla Hanley, the founder, is a dear friend of mine, and I've had multiple conversations with her about her mom wanting to be a sparkling wine producer from the beginning of the winery. So now we have 1984, we have Navarro Vineyards and their first bottling. And then, boom, we have the Champagne House of Louis Roeder, the makers of Cristal. They look to expand in the New World and they look to California. They purchased 580 acres and named their new property Roeder Estate. Their first bottling is in 1988. Now, these champagne houses were genius in marketing luxury goods. And I want to invite Alan, I beg your pardon, I want to invite Tom in to discuss this.
The modern wine boom in California has been defined by a lot of academics and researchers as starting around 1980. And that's when wine tourism really begins in this country. It had been going on in Europe for a long time, obviously, but the idea of visiting a winery had just gotten started. Anderson Valley was pretty rural. There weren't tasting rooms, so there wasn't very much to establish a reputation for the valley until these sparkling wine houses came along and made wine that rivaled French champagne. It was the best sparkling wine made in the country at that time by quite a long way. And the ambitions of John Scharfenberger, who is a serial entrepreneur and has been successful in many areas of food and wine, and obviously Louis Roeder in France, and Milla in her own way was also a wonderful communicator. They managed to carry the reputation of Anderson Valley far and wide through California and across the country. And without the sparkling wine houses, we might have struggled to get the reputation that we have today and still enjoy, because these sparkling wineries are still going great guns. They're still making fabulous wine and it's still available all over the country.
Thank you, Tom. Now let's talk about the 90s. So we have a national shift, a national palate shift. Americans begin to switch from enjoying sweet white wine to having an interest and a desire for red wine. So of course, with the demand being red, a Pinot Noir boom happens all over California, and Anderson Valley is no different. And in 1997, we have Duckhorn cellars out of Napa look to the Anderson Valley to form their Pinot Noir focused label, GoldenEye Winery. We also have in 1997 a discovery of new French clones. And again, I want to invite my friend Tom to talk about this.
So grapevines are like human beings. They have DNA and they differ. So there isn't just one type of Pinot Noir, just like there's not one type of sommelier. We have two here and they look completely different. And Pinot Noir vines, the clones of Pinot Noir, can be quite different as well. And the heritage clones, the famous ones that have been around for a long time, were known to be terribly finicky in the growing season. If it rained too close to certain times of harvest, they would, curl up into a fetal position. If it hailed or was frosty too late in the season, they would refuse to set flowers. They were just hard to grow. And if you got bad conditions late in harvest, the grapes had thin skins and soft leaves, and they were just so vulnerable. So Pinot Noir was hard to grow, and a lot of people were not fond of it, but we have such a perfect climate for Pinot Noir here. And the French scientists had been quietly in the background developing crossbreeding and figuring out some new varieties of Pinot Noir that were not so finicky in the vineyards and that would get ripe in cool climates that had rain at the beginning of the season and the end of the season. And that's Anderson Valley in a nutshell. So the vintners who had been struggling with their old heritage clones suddenly were able to plant side by side with them, or in addition to them, these wonderful, robust new clones from France that ripened the fruit more reliably, they set more flavors, they took minerals out of the soil in a better way from the rootstocks. And so they were just a revolutionary opportunity for the New World, the United States and New Zealand, Australia, to plant Pinot Noir that was going to behave well and be reliable for a nation that was trying to establish a wine industry. You need to have reliable, well-ripened fruit. And so these new clones came, and Anderson Valley had this suddenly incredible, special combination of old clones that had been brought over from Europe. Hans Kobler, who planted Lazy Creek, brought his original plant material from France himself in a suitcase and planted it at Lazy Creek, and those vines are still there. We have Martini, Lee, Swan. All of these old clones are named for the people who originally smuggled them in from France. And so we still have those. We have vineyards that are just one of those varieties, which is incredible to still have. And we also have the new, wonderful, modern, successful French clones. So we've got this clonal advantage of old plant material, new plant material, terroir that's been farmed to Pinot Noir for a long time, and terroir that's been farmed to the new clones. So we have a richness of plant material here and a richness of growing heritage in the terroir that most of the Pinot Noir regions in California don't have, because they started later and they only started with the new clones, and they had pretty much a unitary type of appellation where the weather was the same, unlike Anderson Valley where it's varies so much from end to end. So we have a really fantastic situation here since 1997, and that's one of the reasons that our Pinot Noir reputation has really taken off.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom. And when we look at the numbers, in 21 years, we have the annual production grow 550%. That is great. That is fascinating to me. Let's talk about the Anderson Valley in numbers. So our appellation is about 57,000 acres. The acres under vine, or the acres that are planted with vineyards, about 2,500. Our average vineyard size is 27 acres. That's relatively small. We have 90 vineyards and 30 bonded wineries. We have 54 winery members of the Anderson Valley Wine Growers Association. Although we only have 30 bonded wineries in the valley, we have much more producers that do not necessarily live in the valley make wine from this beautiful fruit. And I believe Evan has quite an experience with these.
Absolutely. It's actually been pretty remarkable, kind of building the list at Single Thread. We had a huge Pinot Noir focus. It just went so well with Chef's Cuisine. It probably would have been irresponsible almost to not feature Anderson Valley, even if we were just supporting the Sonoma producers, because so many of them feature Anderson Valley in their portfolio in some way. It's almost like there's kind of like this like magnetism that seems to draw everybody up there that makes great Pinot Noir. If I was to list like the top 10 best Pinot Noir producers in the state, I bet 9 of them would have Anderson Valley in their book in some way. Some of the most amazing producers like Costa Brown, they now own, they went so far as to buy a vineyard up there, the really amazing Cerise vineyard. It eventually drew up Mr. Bert Williams, may he rest in peace, one of the true legends of California Pinot, who moved up there after selling Williams-Sonoma, and he planted Morning Dew Ranch, which is actually now owned, that caught the attention of one of the major kind of mega wineries in Napa, now owned by Castello di Amorosa. Cobb Wines, Arista has Fisher Vineyard up there, Radio Coteau, Mr. Eric Sussman, Literai, Ted Lemon has done really incredible things with the fruit up there. Fela, Mr. Aaron Jordan, the Pei family, they have this one little feather in their cap. It's pretty much all estate fruit except for their Savoy bottling. That's really amazing. Copan, a winery not too far outside of town here in Healdsburg, kind of made its name and staked its reputation on primarily Anderson Valley fruit. Pietro Perry has Charles Vineyard. Yeah, it's a really important part. Even people as far south as Santa Barbara, actually, my good friend Drake Whitcraft drives all the way up here himself to source fruit from Anderson Valley and brings it all the way back down and makes it in Santa Barbara. So yeah, it's a really important part. Even though it can tend to be a little bit, not as maybe well known by name as something like Russian River. Pretty much, especially in the industry, pretty much everybody really has this reverence and appreciation for just how good the wine is coming from up north.
Thank you, Evan. Again, when we look at these numbers, we have 30 bonded wineries. And just to put it into perspective, I believe the Napa Valley has over 700 bonded wineries. I believe Sonoma County, or Sonoma Valley, I beg your pardon, has over 400 bonded wineries. So here we are with our 30 bonded wineries. So let's talk about climate in Anderson Valley. We definitely are a maritime desert climate. When we look at this number at the top, the 53 degrees average temperature, this number does not necessarily mean that it's 53 degrees consistently in the Anderson Valley. We take the annual daily highs and the annual daily lows, we combine them to get this number. And the significance of it is that we are one of the coolest wine growing regions in California. I believe Karen McNeil said that we are the coolest wine growing regions in California. So this has an incredible contribution to beautiful acidity that our wines have. So let's talk about diurnal shift. So diurnal shift refers to an extreme shift in high and low temperatures within a 24-hour period of time. So we have that gorgeous Pacific Ocean to the northwest of us. As it pushes the fog in, our temperature drops extremely. It could be on a summer's day 100 degrees in the community of Boonville and drop to 50 degrees in the evening. And again, I'm going to invite Evan to kind of talk about what that does to the wine.
Yeah, it's as Tom was alluding to, it really depends on where you are in the valley. But I think what this slide spoke to me was, and kind of why it's so heavily featured in other producers' books, is because it represents a really distinct style in California. Those really, really warm days followed by very cool nights produces its own unique sort of flavor profile. It gets this richer, darker, kind of like plum-driven sort of fruit profile, those darker fruit flavors, even like cranberries and raspberries. Whereas if you head farther south, especially along the coast in Sonoma, you get more of the red fruit, more of the cherries, more of the strawberries. But the fact that it does cool down so much at night kind of prevents that, photosynthesis from continuing to happen. So you get that really great preservation of acidity. So even though they're kind of brooding and powerful, it ends up being this, sort of, nervy, kind of, still fresh on the palate style of Pinot that's kind of like both powerful, but also like elegant at the same time.
Thank you, Evan. I know this slide has a lot of information in it. We're talking about rainfall. And again, we have an average, 40 inches average of rainfall. That does not necessarily means that it rains 40 inches every year in the Anderson Valley. Quite on the contrary. Many years we have 10 inches of rain, and then the very next year we would have 60 inches of rain. Then the next year we will have 20 inches of rain, and then 70 inches of rain. This causes a stress to the vine that I believe creates a really complex and beautiful attributes. Here we have elevation indicators. So this is a gorgeous aerial shot of the Anderson Valley. So we have the ridges, where we have more wind. We have the valley floor, which has that summer fog and winter frost. And as you're driving down valley, for every mile that you drive towards the Pacific Ocean, the temperature drops about 1 degree. So it could be, it's typically 30 degrees cooler on the coast in Mendocino, which is 30 miles away. Another fascinating thing about this photograph that I believe Tom pointed out is that you can see multiple soils. And here are some of the most common soils in Anderson Valley. At the time of the application for the appellation, I believe there was 24 different varietals of soil types that were listed. So let's talk about the growing season in Anderson Valley. Now, Alan, I know you have had multiple years or vintages of growing in the Anderson Valley. Was there any, can you share any extremes in the spring or the fall?
Well, I can remember on Greenwood Ridge, we had a couple of years in the 80s where we had over 100 inches of rain. The ridge usually gets a lot more rain than the valley floor, but we also don't get as much fog. And you also don't have the frost, because the fog and the frost, the cold air settles below in the valley. We only had a few cold spots where we had frost and we had no frost protection. So that's one difference. But we had late ripening varieties like Cabernet, and very often we were harvesting in November. I could remember pressing in a hailstorm. So it was typically, it was late in the year that we would get cold weather, and the grapes wouldn't want to get ripe because of the late ripening varieties we had. In a warm year, the Cabernet came out great. In a cool year, it just wouldn't get ripe.
Great, thank you. Tom, do you have anything to contribute to the climate of the growing season?
This is another one of those things that sets Anderson Valley apart from a lot of other places, is the degree of difficulty that we have, because there's not a lot of wiggle room. We can get frost into late April, and serious hard frost in late April that really stops vines from flowering and setting fruit. And we can also get cold snaps and rain in September, early October, when a lot of other regions have sort of warm sun and they're just like watching the grapes hang there in the sun. In Anderson Valley, we're biting our nails, watching the nighttime temperatures start to drop into the 30s in September. That can be freaky. So the growers here, basically, there's never a dull moment. You're like sweating it out to when you can get your tractors in after the rain. You're sweating it out to thin your crop and make sure you have the right levels for the sun and the rain that you got last year. You're praying that you have enough time to get everything right. It's not easy here. It's kind of like in gymnastics where they give you a grade on degree of difficulty at the end of your routine. Anderson Valley grape growers have a high degree of difficulty. And that's another thing that makes the wine so wonderful.
Thank you, Tom. So I really found these numbers fascinating. I took the varietal breakdown of 1982 and compared it to the last vineyard census in 2018. We see this incredible jump of Pinot Noir going from 8% to 69%. We see Riesling go from 20% to 1%. We see Gewürztraminer drop to 4%. We as consumers need to purchase those wines more. We do have Chardonnay holding strong. Although a lot of the sparkling houses do use most of the Chardonnay, we do make exceptional still Chardonnay in the valley. Now, Evan shared with me this blind tasting, industry blind tasting sort of trick he did. Evan?
I won't call anybody out by name, but it was one of my favorite things to do at Single Thread. Whenever we had industry join us, I would, particularly winemakers or sommeliers, I would pour Mendocino and often specifically Anderson Valley Chardonnay next to Chablis, oftentimes Francois Ravenel. I would actually go as far as to tell them one of these is Old World Chardonnay, one of these is New World Chardonnay. I just want you to tell me which one is which. And the vast majority of my industry friends got this one wrong. I'll say actually the only person I remember off the top of my head who actually got it right was Katie Wilson of LaRue Wines, a very talented maker, but many others got it wrong. Just kind of showcasing that vibrant acidity that's attainable there. Oh,
I believe she knows our fruit well.
Oh, very much so. And I also, I did want to mention on that slide, we were talking as we were kind of setting up for this, it can be almost misleading when you look at that slide to see how Riesling and Gewürztraminer shrink so much in percentage, because it also is just masking the fact that it might not be that they tore out all the Riesling and Gewürztraminer, but Pinot Noir just grew by that much so as to dwarf the percentage so dramatically. So, you know, if you know nothing about the valley and you see that chart, you might not realize that there's still some of the best Riesling and Gewürztraminer grown in the state, you know, being produced there, you know, with Reeve and Cobb doing their Vonnerberg Riesling. It's really incredible. Of course, Greenwood Ridge, really high quality. Hanley, Phillips Hill. I mean, some of the best noble rotted Riesling. I personally, we actually served that often at Single Thread, the botrytized Navarro late harvest. Their special select, they call it. I think it's the best sweet wine in the state. We poured it actually really often at Single Thread. So maybe it's not that people aren't buying it, but maybe you should tell your winemaker you're willing to pay $40 for a bottle of dry Gewürztraminer. That'll kick the plantings up. But yeah, I mean, those Alsatian wines just do so incredibly well up there.
The other thing we should point out about this too, Evan, it's a great point that we haven't lost that original material. And it's grown in places where over this, 34-year period, 36-year period, the Riesling and Gewürztraminer remain in the best possible places for them. And they've been farmed there for generations. And so this is incredible. These are fabulous examples of those two varieties in this country.
Thank you, Tom. So here's California's percentage breakdown. We create 5.4% of California's total production. I refer to us as tiny but mighty. So this is where we'll engage Evan in talking about the wines. Evan, how do you use the wines of Anderson Valley in a beverage program?
Yeah, so it was definitely an important part of what I'd call like the Sommeliers toolbox there, because we wanted to have all the flavor profiles represented. So when people came looking for, especially Chardonnay and Pinot Noir for us, we would have sort of every facet covered depending on what they were looking for. For me, if somebody was like for instance, a Russian River fan, the wines there are amazing, and they wanted to try something else, I found that Anderson Valley was often, you know, perhaps it might be new to them, or maybe they weren't as familiar with it, and it can be a really interesting jumping off point into getting into some more, herbal, savory, earthy flavors. It's sort of, you get that more, you're starting to get more of that like redwood forest floor, those kind of like, for me, almost like a sanguine, like iron-like characteristic I often get off of Anderson Valley Pinots, and really like a floral quality to them that I really enjoyed kind of pointing out to people when it was strong for me. And actually in preparation for this class, I popped open to get in the spirit of things, 2016 Baxter Langley, which to me was like straight perfume, like rose water and violets, really amazing, and pretty distinct for me for Anderson Valley. And so when I would use it for, at Single Thread in particular, would often be with some of Chef Kyle's proteins, the duck that we sourced from Sonoma, from nearby Sebastopol. Was just absolutely amazing with Anderson Valley Pinot, particularly when you put darker flavors, richer flavors on the dish, like blood orange. It was also extremely good with the Wagyu that we got in, pretty much no matter how we prepared it. I find Wagyu to get, I mean, you want to really taste those like subtle nuances of the high quality of the meat. So sorry, I have a cat jumping around behind me. So you really want to taste like how good that meat is. For me, I tried not to blow it out of the water with, you know, Cabernet or Syrah. So going with Anderson Valley Pinot for me was absolutely perfect, because you still get a little bit of grip, and you get enough kind of dark fruit profile. So we frequently used it as sort of our main entree pairing wine.
Wonderful.
Evan, could you talk a little bit about the age worthiness of the wine? Have you had any experience with that?
Absolutely.
A lot of people are curious about it, because I believe Pinot Noir is at its best 5 to 7 years. At least that's what they say in France. And I was always curious to see if that would be true in this country. What do you think?
Really depends on the producer and the style they're making. And one thing about Anderson Valley, much like Sonoma Coast, it's really hard to find aged wines from these areas where the yields are low, and the thought for how well they would age really, I think we're only now starting to understand with the levels of production that there've been, like how well it can be, you know, 15, 20 years on. I've definitely had some at 10 years that I think were young.
Yep.
Especially from producers like Black Kite. They've been so generous, you know, they have a tiny little library, but, you know, giving us a couple bottles here and there at a time. And I found the wines were just barely hitting their peak. You know, I've had I feel like similar styles of Burgundy in their youth that, you know, I've tasted the same producer going back 50 years. And, you know, depending on the vintage, sometimes still drinking absolutely incredibly well. So it's hard for me to put a cap on it. I think with that much acidity preserving the wines, I think, you know, given the vintage and the way it's handled, I honestly would find it hard to say a limit, because, like I said, I've tasted lots from the mid-2000s and not too much before that. I'd have to struggle to think about it. But when I could find them on the market, I would pretty much always buy them, because for me, they were always drinking so spectacularly well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now, I want to ask the three of you, how do you see the future of Anderson Valley? Let's start with you, Tom.
I think we're going to continue to see this rare and wonderful combination of really diligent local farmers and vintners in the Valley, a strong community of vintners and winemakers who are making each other better. And at the same time, this intense interest, as Evan was describing earlier, in Anderson Valley fruit on the part of some of the best winemakers in the state. So we've got the local people who are close to the ground, close to the processes, close to the climate, close to the terroir, and we've got some of the best winemakers in the rest of the state joining them in this big experiment on how great Anderson Valley Pinot Noir can be. And the white wines are also, believe it or not, finding new ways to surprise and delight us. When Pinot Gris came into the Valley, people had some doubts about it, and then suddenly Robert Parker was saying the best Pinot Gris he ever had came from Anderson Valley. So that's because of the mix of local knowledge and commitment and outside influence and experience. And I think that's just going to continue for us.
Wonderful. Alan?
I agree with everything that Tom said. And one thing that I keep thinking about is, obviously we have some climate change. They talk about global warming. And so a lot of wine growing regions are warming up. And I wonder if that's going to happen here, because as the inland temperature gets warmer, it sucks in the fog more. So it's possible this area might even cool off, or at least have more fog. So it'd be very interesting to see how that comes to play.
Thank you, Alan. Evan?
Yeah, it's I think much like certain parts of Sonoma, I wouldn't see it changing that much in the next 10 years. I think what draws me a lot to it is the sort of small farmer kind of grower producer mentality that's often up there. It's a very kind of rustic vibe up there that I would imagine if you go up there 10 years from now, it's not going to feel that much different. But the quality of the wines, I think, is just going to continue rocketing upward, in my humble opinion. I think we're in such a place that's easy to forget how recent this area is as wine country. Old vines are extremely rare. I mean, our definition of old vines would be extremely young vines in Burgundy. So like 25 years old in Burgundy is like, oh yeah, they're really just getting their feet wet. And so I think as vines, get the roots down even further, and people refine their techniques even further, I think the quality is just going to continue to skyrocket. Only getting, about 20 to 30 chances at it, over the course of the last few decades to refine technique. It's really not that much in the grand scheme of things. So I think it's really incredible to see how far it's come, and the amazing, like I said, in my opinion, world-class wines that are already coming out of here at such a kind of young age in wine country terms.
Great, thank you. I would like to see more tourism up here. It would be great to have people learn a little bit more about the Anderson Valley, and that's exactly why we put together this class. Now we will have a Q&A. I believe I have a list of questions that everyone has sent in, and I'll go ahead and read them. This is for all panelists from Kaylee. Which varieties would you like to see more plantings of in Anderson Valley?
I'll let the real experts here go.
Yeah, Semillon.
Well, Pinot Gris.
I'd say, yeah, other Alsatian varieties would probably likely do really well there. I've also developed a love affair for Sylvaner, which I mean, another Alsatian variety, but that'd be super interesting, I think.
Yep.
Okay. From Peter, any interest, success with the varietal Cabernet Franc? That can go to Tom or Alan.
I don't think there's any in the valley that I know of. Is there?
No.
There was a plan for some, Alan, when the Franc wave hit in Napa in the 90s. A lot of producers of Cabernet were looking to distinguish and differentiate in Napa and Sonoma, and Cab Franc is one of the 5 Bordeaux varieties that red Bordeaux is made from. So people felt that Cab Franc would be something to bring to Northern California. It turned out that it is such a prolific grower and puts such green flavors into wine that the people who had planned to plant it here saw what was going on and said, no, let's not do that. We do not have the terroir for Cab Franc here, I'm sorry. It would be nice, and if we could grow Cab Franc here, we'd grow Zinfandel instead.
There is Cab Franc in Yorkville, I believe.
Yeah. I think the American palate is also very scared of green flavors in wine. I really like, for instance, I bet if you were to maybe ripen Cab Franc, it might taste something similar to Loire Valley Cab Franc, which is sort of a terrifying style of wine for a lot of the general American wine drinker.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. Does Zinfandel do well in Anderson Valley? If so, better on the valley floor or hillside?
I don't think there is much there isn't much on the valley floor, but it seems to do well on the ridges.
Great. Let's see. This question is for Evan. Which is the best value producer of Pinots that you are excited to see continue to develop in the coming years? It's a little dangerous.
Best value producer? You said best value producers?
Yes, I believe that's what she said.
If
Everyone in Anderson Valley, Evan, right?
That's right. That's right.
well, I mean, I may have already mentioned it, but I don't know about it's hard to say value because I think that the appreciation is already there. It's, nobody's, that I typically featured on the list, for example, is, sub $20 a bottle, because the wines are incredible and they deserve, they deserve the prices that they're fetching. But I'm just a huge fan of the Baxter family wines. Phil Baxter does just such an incredible job. I'm huge fan. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to say value. I'd have to think about that. But yeah, really excited about his wines in particular from all over Mendocino, Anderson Valley in particular.
Okay, we have another question for Evan. And well, the question starts, I just wanted to can we see that question again? Because they start with, Evan, you pair tomatoes with rosé like 𝚑𝚘𝚗𝚘. And I've had this pairing and it's so incredible. I believe it's one of my favorite, the pairing that you do there is one of my favorite pairings I've had of all time.
It's
but
awesome.
The question is what proteins do you love to pair with Pinot Noir versus Malbec or Cab Sauv?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't use a lot of Malbec when I pair. In fact, the last time that I used it regularly was at the Native American restaurant I got my start at, because we had lots of kind of wild game proteins, like bison, for example, and elk, that tended to match up with that slightly gamey characteristic of Malbec. But for me personally, I've kind of fallen into a trap. It might be a deficiency, depending on how you look at it, of using a variety of Pinot Noirs with proteins. I kind of had a revelation. I was having Wagyu beef actually at 𝐕𝐵𝐺 down south. And I had actually Sonoma Coast Pinot Noir with it. And I also had side by side, I also had Côte-Rôtie from my favorite producer, Gangloff. And I thought that the Côte-Rôtie was absolutely horrible with it, even though that wine is, absolutely incredible. It's, in my opinion, one of the best Syrahs on the planet. And I found the Sonoma Coast, it was actually a cob wine. I found that to be kind of singing in harmony, almost like putting a little salt and mushroom on top of your Wagyu. Because you would never pour like blackberry reduced syrup over your Wagyu beef. You would absolutely destroy it. And for me, that's kind of how the wine, how like drinking like a Cabernet or a Malbec can be to like a really like well-crafted piece of meat. But that being said, if there's like a reduced like Bordelaise sauce, any kind of like deeper, richer fruit flavors, or even like elements of gaminess or peppercorn, that's when I would break out the Malbec. But if the preparation is a little more delicate, I would lean more towards the Pinot. I've just been working in a lot of restaurants the last several years where the Pinot side of things was more our jam.
Okay, we also have a question from Gillian Handelman. How can we gain more awareness from the consumer and trade? And do we really want to? Is there a cautionary tale here?
One of the things that Anderson Valley is coming toward pretty quickly is the moment when there's finally enough wine for enough people to taste it for the reputation of the valley to really take off. This was one of the lessons that Charlie Olkin, who writes the Connoisseur's Guide to California Wine, and Charlie formed this principle about California a long time ago, and it said no region will become famous until there's a critical mass of wine for people to taste. And until a lot of people can have the wine, you're not going to have the reputation that draws the crowds. And we just haven't had the production levels. 2,500 acres under vine is nothing. And also the yields are low. We didn't even talk about that. We're not cropping this these vines at, 4 or 5 tons per acre. It's more like 2 or 3. And that's partly the growing season and partly the decision of the winemakers to make really intense, exceptional wine. So as we get more production and as we get more bottlings and more lines of distribution, I think, Gil, we will get the reputation we deserve. I think we're coming close to it.
Great. Thank you, Tom. From Hollis, what percentage of Pinot Noir is going into sparkling wine? Tom, do you by any chance?
What was the question?
The question is, what percentage of Pinot Noir is going into sparkling wine?
Oh gosh, it's all over the map. It can be the slightest little bit of splash to more than 50% in France. Here in Anderson Valley, the amount of Pinot Noir has been declining generally for a couple of reasons. One is that there's so much more demand for that Pinot Noir to be made into still wine. That's one issue. Another is that the ability to get the Chardonnay right and to ferment it to incredible richness has just blossomed so beautifully here. It's not necessary to get you body from red wine, which is what Pinot Noir would be used for. It would be used for body, a little bit of color, and some tannin. And now the white wine varieties that are made into sparkling in Anderson Valley are so good, they don't need the Chardonnay, the Pinot Noir to body it up. And that means some of that Pinot Noir can be made into still wine, which has been very successful for Domaine Anderson. Basically, a lot of the red fruit that Roederer had been using before or bulking out is now made into red wine in Anderson Valley. So everybody wins.
Great. We do have a soil question, so I'll probably call on Tom again. From John, how do the different soil types influence the different styles of Pinot Noir wine?
There are basically 3 topics. One is the native nutrients in the soil. In other words, how much organic matter and good food and minerals are available in the dirt for the vine to take up. So nutrient level is one. Another one is what's called water holding capacity. In other words, the more clay you have in the soil, the more it holds water, and that vine's feet stay wet. And that's going to influence the metabolic chemistry of the entire plant. And then there's some other nuances which we don't get into. So basically the soil in Anderson Valley has fairly low water holding capacity on the slopes, and most of the vineyards are on slopes. There just isn't that much flat land in all of Mendocino County, and there's very little flat land in Anderson Valley. So even though, as Karina said, most of the vineyards are near the highway is like this little skinny ribbon at the bottom of the valley. Most things on slopes. So the water holding capacity is pretty low, the drainage is pretty good, so the vines don't get wet feet. And that's what we want. We want them to have dry feet. Because we are a watershed, the soil is constantly moving. It's being eroded down the hill to the vineyards. And so the nutrient level tends to be pretty high because a lot of minerals and things have been brought down from the hilltops by erosion and wind and water drainage. So because the valley is all cut up and there's so many slopes and so many creeks, what you wind up with is the best of all worlds, lots of different soil types, even close to each other. So a single vineyard might have 4 or 5 soil types under one blanket of vines. And when you harvest that block, you're getting different flavors out of the vineyard that make your wine so much richer.
Great. We do have a lot of questions. We are going to take a couple more. Are the majority of wine sales from the Anderson Valley through restaurants, direct to consumer, or retail? And how is that expected to shift in the wake of the global pandemic? Well,
Karina, that's yours.
I do believe that most of our wineries have incredible direct to consumer sales. You know, they're all very challenged right now with this pandemic. So I would encourage everyone to reach out to the wineries and purchase their wine and support them. And the Wine Growers Association will link you in as well. Let's see. What? We have a silly question, which is, do the ladies in Anderson Valley still harvest topless? No, they do not. Rob Renteria, how big as a region does Anderson Valley want to be? Is there a cap on vineyard growth? Maybe Tom?
Not legally. I mean, there's no restriction from any political authority that would limit it. I think, Alan, the topography does limit it, I think, a certain amount, doesn't it? I mean, we don't have that many roads.
Right, and you can't just clear cut the forest to plant grapes anymore. So there's not all that much open land left.
Thank you. So we're going to go ahead and finish up here. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us and participating in this class. You are an incredible wealth of knowledge, and I am honored to have you on the panel. I'd like to thank the Anderson Valley Wine Growers Association, and we have a list of events that you can participate in the future. We have designated May as Pinot Month, and if you go to the Anderson Valley Wine Growers Association website, you'll see fun offers and games and ways to celebrate Pinot Noir. And next year, we will have our Anderson Valley Pinot Noir Festival. In July, we usually have the Anderson Valley Barrel Tasting Weekend, which is a fabulous event as well. And then in February, we celebrate all these white wine varietals with the Winter White Wine Festival. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope you learned something, and I hope that you will continue to support the wines of Anderson Valley. Thank you.